Welcome to the MacArthur Memorial podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Williams. Join me as we explore the life and legacy of General of the Army Douglas MacArthur and discuss a wide range of military history topics from the American Civil War to the Korean War. Let's get started. I'm Amanda Williams, and I'm here with my fellow historian, Jim Zobel, MacArthur Memorial archivist. And today we're going to talk about General MacArthur's heroes. Now, we know that MacArthur drew inspiration from various mentors that he had, from people he admired, and of course, he had a personal pantheon of historical figures that he admired. But who are his heroes? Who are these people in this pantheon? So, Jim, let's just get started. Let's do this rapid fire, just back and forth. Why don't you start? Who is one of MacArthur's heroes?
Dad.
His dad, Arthur MacArthur Jr.
He supersedes all of them. I mean, MacArthur grows up, hearing about everything he did and studies the Civil War so much that they say he knows it, almost as if he was in it. And I think that's all just because of his father, that the Missionary Ridge thing is preeminent in his mind, I think, all the time. He basically, I think he gets his whole manner of speech from his dad, the way he writes, because if you look at his brother, Arthur III, he's the same way, the way he speaks as well as the way he writes. And I think both of them get that from their dad, that whole MacArthur ethic of boldness.
Right.
Of bold action is the way to make things happen. That all comes from his dad, because of Missionary Ridge, I think. And so I think that, in this pantheon that, he's the one that he admires most and probably models himself after the most.
And I think he actively cites his father as that direct influence on his career, on his values, and just how he just operates. And I think he so reveres his father's, this image he has in his head of his father's bravery during the Civil War. So
and his capabilities, and growing up on those forts, out west where it's just them together, and with that small group of infantry, the 13th, that his style of creating headquarters later, where it's more like a family atmosphere. Right. I think that totally comes from his dad, because that was the way they operated on the frontier, that they were all interdependent upon each other. So it's a lot of different ways, but, I think his dad is probably, superior to all of you.
And going with that family theme, I mean, I think he looked up to his brother, Arthur MacArthur III, quite a bit. I mean, he's kind of a pace setter for him as kind of a young boy. And certainly the mother, I think, Mary Peggy Hardy MacArthur, while we might not think of her in the same vein as some of the other heroes, because he obviously has a lot of military figures as heroes, I think he saw a great strength in her that was then mirrored by his wife, Jean MacArthur. And I think he very much admires that strength of character, strength of will, maybe not bold in the ways that his father and maybe Napoleon, who we can talk about in a little while, are, but just this source of strength and kind of keeping the family, keeping the group together.
I agree. And, she's got that rationale that I think he respects. So I think that she's, very much adept at helping him move through army circles, as well as politicians, at that point. So, no, I agree with that completely. Yeah.
Pershing.
I think he models himself somewhat after Pershing in early World War II. I think that he always wants that blessing from Pershing, but he never really gets it, Marshall does, so to speak. And I think that MacArthur kind of longed for that. And it's really not until, he gets Pershing his pension in the, late 30s that really seals the deal between them, that, Pershing doesn't just look at him as this upstart anymore, which he probably, it seems like that's the way he looked at him, predominantly. I think that Funston, probably has a big effect on Douglas MacArthur, the guy who captures Aguinaldo that we've talked about, because again, that's that lesson of of boldness like his dad had, and that lesson of going behind the lines, capturing Aguinaldo, basically ending the Philippine American War officially, at the start. I think he looks to those two probably as some of the biggest influences on him, of just how a soldier should act, what matters most in combat, so to speak. So I think that those two really are on top. Maybe, as far as like people he knows, I think Leonard Wood comes into that a lot because when Leonard Wood's chief of staff, he's a master of the press. And I think that Douglas MacArthur learns how to handle the press, through Leonard Wood. And I think that Woods has his ideas of preparedness are very much ingrained into Douglas MacArthur. Almost, because like almost when Arthur MacArthur dies, Leonard Wood kind of comes into that position, as the guy who's schooling him on the army and how the things work. And Wood and his father were very much similar in thinking. I think he models his ideas of how he's going to build that Philippine army in 35 is a lot of the way Leonard Wood had designed things. He doesn't follow Wood because Wood didn't believe in Philippine independence, which MacArthur doesn't agree with. But, as far as like people that he knows that are alive, I think they probably have the biggest effect on MacArthur is Arthur MacArthur and Funston and Leonard Wood.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
Moving out a little farther afield then. So, he's growing up, he's born in the 19th century and he's growing up at a time when I think a lot of young men are looking to people like Theodore Roosevelt for their idea of what it means to be kind of a strong man, a great man, a courageous man. I think I would throw Teddy Roosevelt in there as someone that maybe more from afar. He would have been very ingrained in this idea of having a crowded hour of kind of proving yourself on some battlefield or in some difficult task. So I think he would have grown up certainly with that and probably with an admiration for someone like Teddy Roosevelt.
Well, he's so predominant over young men, at that time, like you said, with his way about a man. I mean, because what Roosevelt thought that, combat was the only place that a man could actually really prove himself. And until he had been through that, he really wasn't a man. And so I think that had a great effect on a lot of those people that go into the Pan Am War, go into the World War One. So yeah, I would think that has a very big effect on Douglas MacArthur. All these really greats, that we think of at the time, but he's contemporaries with them, and they are the ones who really kind of mold him and push him on. I think that he's growing up meeting tons of Civil War veterans. Talking to all of them, and they're having a great effect on him. I mean, at that centennial at West Point, when they finally brought the Confederates back, and Lee's chief of staff is there, Longstreet's there, and you've got E. Porter Alexander and all these guys that were, in the midst of all the battles. I mean, you can't help but, I think, be influenced by all of them. I mean, because Sherman's still alive when he's a young kid, and it's crazy. I mean, things like we don't really see today.
Yeah. And I mean, following along the theme of the American Civil War, obviously he is very interested in Lee and he's very interested in Grant. He looks up to both of them as kind of, I think in his mind, very effective military commanders. I think with Lee, he sees kind of a sense maybe of honor and sacrifice and kind of loyalty and maybe kind of strategic talents. And then I think with Grant, just a relentless determination to do what has to be done, perhaps. So I don't know. What do you think he thinks about both of them?
No, I think that completely, that and all those guys at West Point were that way. The Civil War is the thing that's drummed in them the most, at that point when they're going through West Point. And so you'll see throughout World War II all these generals who, look to both Union and Southern generals. That's where they learn tactics. That's where they learn strategy, is from, the campaigns that were there. I mean, they get into Napoleonic wars, for sure, but I think that the campaigns of the Americans, I mean, you look at Patton always talking about Stonewall Jackson, and you look at, all these guys. Eisenhower, ranks Lee in the top of the pantheon, of military people that they look up to. So I mean, and that is a part of the academy as well, for all these people that look to that. And then, like, we just said it, who's the greatest that he sees in history? Napoleon's definitely one of them. I think he writes that one letter that we have where he says that Genghis Khan is like the ultimate, the
Right.
ultimate warrior, and
Right.
there's nobody else like him. And he loved that Harold Lamb book that was written. I guess it was kind of a fictionalized account of Khan because of the Khan, but MacArthur definitely, ranks him up the highest. Uh, and he's talking with a lot of the contemporary, I mean, he's got letters with Basil Liddell Hart, and, talking about all these people. And so, I mean, MacArthur is a great student of military history, and I think he tries to grab elements from all these people throughout history.
After his father, I think Napoleon is probably the historic figure. He was not a contemporary of, that he sees as kind of the greatest.
Yeah.
And I think with Napoleon, it's about being able to bend events to your will, I think. And I think he sees Napoleon as somebody who has the ability to do that. And I think he admires that, but also just the boldness. Again, you talked about boldness with his father and other people, but I mean, Napoleon certainly very bold. And that's, I think the way MacArthur tends to lead with his thinking and leadership. I was going back the other night through a bunch of the speeches that he gave after World War I, and he's always bringing up, Napoleon. He talks even about the Egyptians. He talks about the Babylonians. He talks about the
Right. Yeah.
Byzantines, which I love. So I'm sure maybe he admired Belisarius a little bit. But what surprised me though is he doesn't talk as much about Alexander the Great. Now, obviously, he would have known quite a bit about him. He would have studied his campaigns as well. Here's another figure that seems to bend history to his will. Why do you think it's more Napoleon and not so much Alexander?
Just probably just because, Napoleon is the beginnings of like modern warfare.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of that was applicable to his time as well. Whereas Caesar and, Alexander are, further back in history. And while, totally admirable, they, I think that he looks at them all as, great military leaders. But as far as that ancient world, Genghis Khan was like his guy,
Right.
and not admiring him for, it's solely military,
Mm-hmm.
so, like I don't think he admires Napoleon for all the crazy stuff, that he was about, but I think that just militarily he looks at them as and how much is it where does he believe in the art of war versus, the just the technical applications of war? Does he, see himself as this artist of
Mm-hmm.
war, is more a ethereal thing of luck and
Right.
balance and timing, and he always talks about that timing. So I think there's a lot that MacArthur thinks in that sense, kind of like Halsey was. Halsey was, very fluid, and everybody was just out of their minds trying to work under him because he was just changing operational planning all the time, just on whims, that he has of I'm feeling this, and I think there's a lot of MacArthur in that as well. I
Mm.
think that another one would probably be Gouraud,
Yes.
the French general, and I think MacArthur admires him as a soldier, probably as much as anyone. So I
Mm-hmm.
mean, it's a wide mark of people that he's influenced by. But when you're a soldier, you you are influenced by all these people.
Right.
because they've been there and they've been through what you're gonna go through, and so I think he just, it's taking all those golden nuggets
Right.
from each, thing. And he was a big, he said that in that one letter that we found, that he was a big admirer of Clausewitz,
Mhm.
in his theories of war, and
Right.
how it's so fluid, and it's never something that you can nail quite down, but there are timeless elements to it. So he's always learning from, all these people.
And
Yeah.
that reminds me when he travels to Asia real early in his career to join his father on that kind of fact finding mission throughout Asia. He talks about on that trip meeting Kitchener, I believe, and Sir
Right.
Bin Bin Blood. And then he talks about meeting Japanese generals, so guys right out of the Russo-Japanese War. And I think we talked this morning about him meeting Togo,
Yeah,
Admiral.
which I had forgotten that, or and
Um,
that's right in his reminiscences. He says that. So
and
yeah.
he, the way he writes it, I mean, he obviously these are all like all of the people we've mentioned, complicated people. There's kind of pros and cons, but I think he looks at these Japanese military leaders and these British military leaders, and he admires what they have been able to accomplish in their careers. And so I think it's very clear he looked up to them in some ways. George Washington, is he one of
Sure.
MacArthur's heroes?
Yeah, I would say so. He keeps a picture of him on his wall in Japan, right
Mhm.
in his office there. And sure, that whole frontier ethic, is all part of,
Mhm.
MacArthur's upbringing, and he'll always consider himself a frontiersman. So, I mean, all those heroes of that time,
Right.
Davy Crockett and Boone and Washington and Andrew Jackson, he saw all of them as, these people that were basically having to carve things out of the wilderness, as they speak, and he believed in that pioneer spirit. So it's like you said, it's a pantheon
Mhm.
of all these people that influence him, and throughout all the letters, we see that all the time, where he's referring to these people and talking about them, and
Mhm.
saying, how what he thinks about them. So
And I think with Washington, I think there's also a deep admiration of just somebody who's stoic and principled. I think Pershing he sees sometimes as kind of stoic in a lot
mhm,
of ways. Where MacArthur
right,
it's maybe a more bold charisma, Pershing's more kind of stoic. But I think with Washington, I think there's a level of moral clarity there in some of that stoicism, and I think that's something that MacArthur also tried to emulate. We've talked a lot
sure.
about him being very bold, but I think at the end of the day, this idea of military valor combined with moral clarity, in terms of how you view your mission or what you're trying to do, I think that's something that was pretty a big deal for him.
Yeah, well, I mean, because without Washington, it all falls apart.
Right.
There is no revolution. It ends. It's only because he keeps, pushing them on after defeat after defeat after defeat, and he's like the guidepost that everybody's just looking at. And if you look at that, that first campaign in the Philippines, it's almost the same way. Without MacArthur, there is no defense, and it would have fallen apart, a lot earlier than it probably did, but it was just because people knew of him as that World War One commander, and they had faith that, if anybody's going to get him out of it, it was going to be him. I mean, they'll all find out that it couldn't happen, but I think that was a great part of that defense holding on as long as it did, was
Mhm.
just because of his presence there, and especially for the Filipinos. So I mean, I think that Washington's he's part of everything that, like we were saying, that influences him through time.
And
Yeah.
especially if you're a general that thinks you might one day want to become president of the United States too. Not a bad,
Yeah.
not a bad person to try to admire and mimic.
Well, when we thought about doing this, I was thinking, okay, there's like these couple of guys, but as we're going along, it's they all have an influence,
Mhm.
and they're
Oh, there
all
are
part of it.
dozens, probably.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah.
so when I was thinking about this, I I feel like there is an undercurrent of competitiveness, even with the historic figures in his pantheon. And I think even with his dad, as much as we know he loved and admired him, I think as we've talked about all these figures, I think he still would like to surpass all of them.
Oh, yeah.
Do one better. Yeah, okay, so you agree with me on that then?
Well, it's like when he gets to Japan, and his dad was an administrator in the Philippines, and he'll always say things, how am I doing, Dad? Or when he comes in and the embassy and that portrait of Washington is there, and he's like, well, they didn't have red coats, but we licked them just the same, General. So I think you're probably right. He's like, I could have stood toe to toe with these people, but that's MacArthur, who probably thinks he's more capable than any person on the planet of carrying out a job, or being successful at something. So,
who have we missed?
I don't know. I'm sure some people will point out the people that we've missed, but the more we keep digging through the letters, the more people will find that he's, like this man was, just at the pinnacle of his form, and he says that about so many people. So
I'm sure there's some athletes that he admired quite a bit.
Yeah. Ty Cobb comes to mind because he just thought Ty Cobb was the most dedicated baseball player there was. But no, that was cool because it made me think. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Jim, as always. Stay tuned. When we originally released this program, we used our social media platforms to invite listeners to ask questions about MacArthur's heroes. What follows is that bonus Q&A. All right, well, we are back, Jim and Amanda, here at the MacArthur Memorial. And a few days ago, we released a talk on MacArthur's heroes, and then we invited questions about that topic from listeners and viewers of that program. And thank you we do have some questions, so we are just going to get right into those right now. First question, which of the fleet commanders in the Pacific during World War II did Douglas MacArthur most respect?
Well, I think Halsey's the one he's closest to. After the war, he'll say that Nimitz is unrivaled as one of the greatest admirals there is. He'll also even compliment Admiral King, Fleet Admiral King. He doesn't get along with him well during the war, but after the war, he says, that it was only because of King that the war didn't go on for like a couple of more years,
Because King sided with the return to the Philippines.
And more so because at first they said they want to just have a strategic defensive in the Pacific, but King's really the one that alters all their thinking, especially after the Coral Sea and Midway. He was like, look, we've creamed all these carriers. We've got to move now. And so that's what makes him drop into Guadalcanal, and MacArthur goes into Bunagona, and they start supplying those areas. And MacArthur thought if it hadn't been for King, that probably never would have happened. So, I mean, as far as like the war itself, I think, of course, Halsey is the one that he is closest to. He did question the chase of Ozawa's carriers at Leyte Gulf, but when the staff was really raging against Halsey, MacArthur beat the table and said, I'm not going to hear one more word against Bull.
Right.
And because he's still a fighting admiral in my book. So he was loyal to him, throughout. And I think that, after the war's over, when they're not fighting over supplies and shipping and strategy and all that, then that's when he's like, these guys were the best,
And Kenny?
I think
admired, or at least his talent in that area.
I think Kenny schooled him quite a bit on air power. I think that MacArthur had complete trust in him, because he basically gives him the Air Corps, and it's up to you what you do with it. I mean, he'll overrule him at times during those strategy conferences about certain operations, but I think he has complete and unlimited trust in him, and as well as Whitehead, who was the bomber commander, Ennis Whitehead, for Kinney. And when the war ends and they want to bring Kinney back to this SAC command, and as well they wanted to bring Whitehead back, MacArthur was like, no, you can take Kinney, but if you take Whitehead too, then I have nothing, and you're just causing a big problem, because he's the only guy that can run this out here. So MacArthur has complete trust in both of those people.
Yeah. So the question was about fleet commanders, but in terms of these air commanders, true. Okay, next question. Did MacArthur consider Robert E. Lee to be a hero, or did he just admire the military generalship of Lee?
Well, he doesn't really write about Lee. We know that Freeman, the great biographer of Lee, comes out to see MacArthur in the latter part of the war, and then he goes to see him in Japan as well. And he gave MacArthur the set of 4, Robert E. Lee, and they were of the first 100 copies that they had. I think that, like all those people, like we were talking about the other day, all those people at West Point studied from all of them. It wasn't like, oh, he was a Confederate. No, it was like, what can I learn from this guy? Nathan Bedford Forrest, he's the guy who kind of begins the Klan, basically. But he was also a very incredible tactician, and they all study him. They still study him, up till to today. So, I mean, if you're a military person and you're not studying them just, because of what they would, then you're an idiot. Yeah. And so does he admire him as a hero? I think MacArthur's more of a unionist, like his father, than that. But he never desecrates his memory or anything like that.
I don't see MacArthur as real attached to kind of a lost cause sort of mythology. I think he's very practical. And I think he sees Lee as somebody very talented in some ways. And I think he also admires in defeat how he manages that. And I think he definitely wants to learn from him. But I'm thinking of that video that we saw of Eisenhower.
Right.
And I mean, a similar kind of West Point guy, studied this like MacArthur did. And that as president, and he's a unionist. I mean, he's obviously, like MacArthur, all about the United States as a union.
Yeah.
But he has a portrait of Lee in the Oval Office.
Right.
Here's somebody that he's saying, like, there's something to be learned and admired about this person. He's in the pantheon of, like, America's military figures.
Well, Eisenhower, I think, saw that without Lee, the country wouldn't have healed as fast as it did. Because Lee was, nope, it's over, surrender, and what if he had said, it's still on?
Yeah.
I mean, the Jesse James gang was made out of the Civil War. And the whole time that they were robbing banks, it was, I'm just killing Yankees, and there would have been thousands of those kind of bands if Lee had said, keep it up. And as well, Lee said, don't erect any monuments to the Confederacy. He didn't want that, because he could see them being torn down, and he didn't want Confederate graves dug up. And so that's why, that Eisenhower, I think, was, he was critical to the future of the United States. If it hadn't been for him, the South wouldn't, or the nation wouldn't have healed as fast as it did.
I think MacArthur would have agreed.
Yeah, probably so. He just never writes it down.
Yeah.
In that sense.
Yeah. And then the second part of that question was, what about his mom? Did she consider Lee to be a hero? And I'm just going to say yes to that one.
Yeah, her.
She's a Virginian.
Her niece.
She's a Virginian.
Her niece, who was Mary Simonton, the daughter of Arthur III, said that she was melancholy because she felt like she betrayed her country, which was the South. Yeah. I mean, she marries the #1 super Yankee. All her sisters married Yankees. Yeah. They wanted to get out of the depression of the South, basically. But I think that was always with her, that her 4 brothers had fought under Robert E. Lee.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, you think about, she's thinking, again, she's a Virginian. You've got George Washington in her pantheon, probably, and then you have Robert E. Lee. And then I think in her own mind, her son is half a Virginian. So, I mean, he kind of continues that lineage, I think, for her.
And she's always in his ear. You have to be like these people. You have to live up to this sense of duty and honor like your father has. So it would seem that, you know, she would definitely be holding on to those old values that she had.
Yeah.
You know.
All right, next question. Were there any ancient philosophers he admired?
Well, he quotes Plato and Santayana, you know, both of those, and he will quote, you know, scripture. So I think that, you know, and if you look at his library, he's got, you know, the Upanishads in there. He's got the Mormon Bible. You know, he's got all these religious, you know,
and
people.
Marcus Aurelius' meditations.
Yeah. So I mean, he's definitely aware of them all. You know, it's with MacArthur. You know, when does he write it down? You know, or does he talk about it to anyone? And those we know, but this guy is one of these people who I think picks up those golden nuggets of knowledge from everyone.
Yeah.
You know?
I went through his speeches last night to see if he ever talked about it. Plato's the one that he most often kind of refers to. And there was only one other that I saw in most of those speeches that he gave from in the interwarrior period to the kind of end of his life. And it was Dionysius of Halicarnassus. I might have butchered that. And he was basically using him as kind of an example of saying the law of nature in his mind was that it is always going to be the case that the strong dominates the weak. And so he uses that a lot, you know, in that interwarrior period. And then he uses it, I think, later on in talking about Korea, you know, as the great philosopher said. But anyways, okay. Next question. Were there any other foreign leaders he considered to be his heroes?
Well, we know he thought a lot of Ataturk, the Turkish leader after World War I, who was trying to modernize Turkey, and he met with him, you know, in that 1930s trip. Kazan, you know, he has great admiration for, even though they're opposites politically. I think he had a great respect for John Curtin in Australia. I mean, they work extremely well together, and you know, maybe even Yoshida. You know, we know he says about Chiang, you know, I don't care what he is as long as he's anti-communist. And so, I mean, he would look at, I think, you know, and you wonder about Ri, you know, of Korea and these other people. You know, does he revere them, or you know, does he think they're patriots? He doesn't really say, but he works for them all. But you know, I think there are a few that he really looks to as being better than a lot of the others. But I think Kazan's probably the foreign leader that he you know, is most fond of.
But I think there's a difference too between admiration and hero.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know that he really, any of the contemporaries, I don't think he looks at any of them except for maybe Pershing when he was younger as like a hero in his time. Maybe Pershing, Funston, his dad.
His dad, yeah.
But not a lot of contemporary. And certainly I think by the time
certainly
of the
not
Korean
politicians.
War,
yeah.
no,
yeah.
I don't think there's anyone during the Korean War where he's thinking, wow, I really, except for maybe the American soldier.
And he thinks Hoover is somewhat of a good guy.
Master diplomat and statesman. Yeah. So maybe, but he does always go back to that idea of like, you know, the soldier, you know, the one that he's seen on all these battlefields, this amalgamation of like all of these troops that he's led, that he does seem to idolize as like the pinnacle of what society can produce. The soldier willing to sacrifice himself for duty.
No, I would say that too. That amalgamation of you know, different principles that makes the ultimate soldier. Sure.
Yeah. Let's see. Would MacArthur have considered historian Mary Beard to be among the people he admired?
I have no idea. I know that Mary Beard writes to Scap, you know, during the occupation about MacArthur and, you know, women's enfranchisement. But, you know, he doesn't ever say what he thinks about her, you know.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything where he talks about her, but except that in his autobiography and that footnote about the women's suffrage that he helped with, he does really use that opportunity to say, like, this really wonderful scholar, you know, Dr. Mary Beard says that I did an amazing job here.
I missed that.
This is just
that.
No, I mean, so I don't know, maybe he admires her because she very publicly admired him.
Right, who does?
But he does, I mean, there's this huge footnote in Reminiscences where he repeats like a letter or some public statement she made saying that MacArthur and this thing that he's done for women and children in Japan is just the greatest thing that could have happened.
And that's the only thing I remember about her. Yeah.
So we don't know if he followed her work, but he definitely knew who she was and was definitely happy to have her endorsement.
Support, sure.
All right. What about his mother and wife? I think we talked about them in the previous recording, but what qualities did he mention that he found admirable about each of them?
Well, I think, the mom is especially special. I mean, we've talked about that before, about helping him work his way through things. And she's like probably his number one confidant. She's the person who keeps everything together when they're out there on the frontier, making it a home. And she'll always be that way, I think, with him. And I think Jean just kind of, takes over that role when she dies. I mean, because MacArthur's almost immediately married to her, cemented to Jean after his mom dies. So I think that both of them were incredibly important to him, probably more than any other people.
Yeah. They're both, I think, very feminine in kind of that traditional sense that he would have been used to, but I think also both incredibly strong. Like his mom on the frontier, Jean on Corregidor, and I think they're both, maybe Jean more than his mom, absolutely committed to duty on her country too. They get the mission, and they're partners in that mission. So very loyal, very dedicated to the country, to the army,
supporting him.
Were there any other founding fathers that MacArthur considered one of his heroes?
Well, we know he keeps the portraits of Washington and Lincoln on his wall in Japan, and he'll often say that my guides or my mentors for this job in the occupation were Lincoln and Washington, and that's what he says about them.
In his speeches, he talks mostly about Washington, Lincoln, and then Jefferson.
Because of those constitutional principles that he tries to apply to Japan as well.
And then he sometimes talks about Ben Franklin, but it's more of Ben Franklin as kind of a very cheeky member of like the founding fathers group. He always has these little anecdotes about funny things Ben Franklin said, but I didn't, when I looked at his speeches last night, I didn't see Madison, I didn't see,
or Adams, either one of them. No.
Yeah.
No.
So it would seem that Jefferson, Washington, Lincoln are his top, with Ben Franklin sprinkled in there every now and then. Okay, so for a leader that also held his faith close to his heart, did he look to heroes in the Bible?
Well, he says he and his staff even says that he's reading it every day. I don't really remember though. I'd have to go back and look at those as far as, he'll talk about certain passages in speeches, but he doesn't really say anything about, various personas or like the wisdom of Solomon or anything like that. He doesn't really ever lay that out. He'll talk about Jesus a lot
with great reverence.
Yeah.
And
he puts that in a lot of his speeches, where he talks. So it's
But Jesus isn't a hero to him. Jesus is God. He's got his pantheon of heroes, and then I think the way he talks about his father is the top of that pantheon, and then I think you have Jesus Christ at the top for him.
Probably.
I've only ever seen him talk about David and Goliath, and even that was more a metaphor for a military problem or thing he was trying to explain. But I don't, other than Jesus, I don't think I've ever seen him name another biblical character.
No. And just the philosophy of Christianity, which I think was, what he based a lot of things on, because that's what, he'll believe that is something important for Japan after the war, as this democratizing spirit, the spirit of Christianity as well. So,
All right, just two more questions. Was Geronimo on the list of heroes?
I've never seen him say anything. He'll talk about the American Indian quite reverently. When he's given that chief status by the Blackfeet, he'll say that they're the noblest and the greatest warriors. When he talks about World War One, he talks about how they had to adopt the fighting style of the American Indian, to be able to fight on the trench warfare. So, I mean, he has great reverence for him. I mean, he grew up around, Navajo and Apache as well. He would often, he always considered himself a frontiersman because of his life with them. And he would say, I learned to track people, from the Apache when I was a kid, which, if you're able to say that, that's got to be the most valued thing that you hold on to, from if you grew up on the frontier, that, I learned to track from the masters of it. I think he has great reverence for all the, American Indian warriors, but, he doesn't really pick out any like Crazy Horse or Geronimo or, Sitting Bull or any of them really.
That brings up an interesting point, though, because it seems that he just has such tremendous respect across the board for all types of people if they are very skilled at something. It doesn't matter if they were on the losing side or the former enemy.
Yeah.
It's this person or this group of people excel at this, and I admire that. And it doesn't matter maybe if it's politically correct to feel that way or not.
Right.
In his mind, there's value in this, and there's something in me for this. And so I think he's always very willing to look everywhere and find some. You don't tend to see him say, hey, these people are awful. These people are, we need to get rid of these people, or these people are evil forever. He's very, I think, pragmatic.
Well, as a military person, you're trying, you should be trying to understand every military conflict there is and what went right and what went wrong. And I think you could see a lot about the American Indian that was, very much worthy of study.
Last question. This pertains to the Korean War. MacArthur led forces to early victory with the Incheon landing. Did he have a pantheon hero of the past that guided him to the success? And then later, when the war took an unexpected opposite turn to unfortunate demise?
Well, at Incheon, we know that in that meeting where he meets with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he brings up Wolfe and Montcalm at Quebec and scaling the heights and meeting them on the plains of Abraham. And so, I mean, that's in his mind there, that surprise is the key element of all victory in war, no matter, what time frame it is. It's funny because Basil Liddell Hart will write MacArthur and say, was it my book? Was it my book that cued you into Wolfe? Was I the one? And Liddell Hart would do that with like everybody. Was it my book that you read that got you thinking that way? And so I think that definitely in that sense, Incheon probably goes to them, to Wolfe and Wolfe scaling the heights there and taking them behind.
Defeat. Is there a hero in his pantheon that he could look to in kind of after getting fired and say,
Well, I don't know. Probably his dad. Yeah, probably his dad. That once again politicians
defeated by politicians and
destroyed.
Bureaucrats.
And that's the way he'll look at it.
Or is it like Alexander in India at that river? Gotta turn back. Or Napoleon on Elba. I'll come back.
I don't know. I mean,
he's
just trying to rescue the situation at that point, and then at the moment that they're about to really destroy the Chinese, with the spring and summer offensives, that's when he's out. Because when Van Fleet comes in, and when MacArthur leaves, Van Fleet said we could have gone all the way back to the Yalu again, but then we'd been back in the same situation we were before, not able to supply everything up there. So
we saw that quote in Reminiscences the other day about Pershing, when MacArthur says, through these difficult times in the Pacific War and then in the Korean War, I always imagine, I could feel Pershing's warm
steady hand
on my back.
Right,
so I wonder, is perhaps Pershing, they obviously different career trajectories and ends of their careers, but maybe he took some comfort in
Well, does he
knowing.
feel that way throughout? And he'll say that about Korea, quote from Stonewall Jackson, which is, I'll fight him with sticks and stones if I have to. And he'll say that a number of times to people, so I mean, those people are cropping up no matter what kind of situation he's in. This makes me think of that person. This makes me think of that person.
Yeah.
So definitely well read and definitely well rounded on historical perspective, I think.
Agreed. Yeah. And I think we've covered them all, and I think we'll close on that. So thank you, Jim, for your time.
Amanda Williams.
No, it's no problem at all. And thank you for your questions that were submitted. We kind of enjoy talking these things out and puzzling them out. So I think we'll try to do this again sometime soon. We hope you enjoyed that episode. If you have questions, comments, or topic suggestions, the MacArthur Memorial team wants to hear from you. You can reach us at MacArthurMemorial@norfolk.gov or find us on X at MacArthur1880 or on Facebook and Instagram as MacArthur Memorial.